Welcome back to Old State Valuable Coins. Today, we're taking a closer look at a tiny United States dime that could have a much bigger story than its 10-cent face value suggests. The 1982 D. Roosevelt dime, struck at the Denver Mint. At first glance, it may look like nothing more than an old, scratched, toned coin hiding in a drawer or forgotten collection. But here, where things get interesting. Some exceptional dimes have brought surprisingly strong prices at major coin auctions because of extraordinary condition, sharp strikes, full bands detail, and intense collector competition. So before you dismiss that little dime as ordinary pocket change, stay with us, because we're going to uncover what makes the special, what collectors actually look for, how rare high-grade examples can become, and whether a coin like yours could be hiding something truly unusual. Keep watching until the end, because the difference between an ordinary dime and a valuable collectible can sometimes be found in details smaller than a grain of rice. Let's get started. First up in the imagine, finding a small Roosevelt dime dated 1982 with a tiny D beneath the portrait, perhaps scratched, darkened by age, and looking like an ordinary 10-cent coin. At first glance, there is nothing spectacular about it. It is not a silver dime, it is not an ancient coin, and more than 500 million examples were struck at the Denver Mint. Yet this particular date can lead collectors into one of the most fascinating corners of modern United States coinage, because the difference between an ordinary 1982 D. Roosevelt dime and an elite example is enormous. The 1982 D had a reported mintage of 542,713,584 pieces, making it common in absolute numbers, but condition, strike quality, full bands detail, surface preservation, and certification can completely change the conversation. The documented auction history proves that extraordinary examples have brought four-figure prices, including a remarkable $1,410 heritage auctions result for a PCGS-graded 1982 D with full bands in April 2014, while the regular issue also reached $1,140 for an NGC MS-68 at Stack's Bowers in August 2018. Those numbers do not mean every 1982 D dime is worth hundreds or thousands of dollars. Quite the opposite. They show why coin collecting is a game of tiny differences, where millions of ordinary coins can exist while only a microscopic fraction become genuinely desirable at the highest grades. Understand why this dime matters, we have to travel back to 1982, a year when the United States was experiencing one of the most difficult economic periods since the Great Depression. Ronald Reagan was president, and the country was in the middle of the severe 1981-82 recession. The Federal Reserve, under Chairman Paul Volcker, had pursued extremely tight monetary policy to break the inflation that had plagued Americans throughout the 1970s. The consequences were painful. Interest rates had reached extraordinary levels, businesses struggled to borrow, manufacturing suffered, construction was hit hard, and unemployment climbed to nearly 11% by the end of 1982. Federal Reserve historical records show that real gross national product fell during the year, and unemployment reached approximately 10.75% by year-end, while inflation finally began moving substantially lower. In other words, when the 1982 D dime was being produced and released into American commerce, the country was not living through an easy period. Every 10-cent coin represented a tiny piece of everyday economic life: vending machines, pay phones, stores, parking meters, newspapers, and pocket change. A dime was small, but Americans handled millions of them every day. The story of the 1982 D becomes even more interesting when we remember what a Roosevelt dime actually represents. The series began in 1946, shortly after the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and the United States Mint released the new dime on January 30, 1946, the date that would have been Roosevelt's 64th birthday. The choice of the dime was deeply symbolic because Roosevelt had been closely associated with the March of Dimes and the national fight against polio. The design was created by chief engraver John R. Sinek, whose initials, JS, appear near the bottom of Roosevelt's neck on the obverse. The front shows Roosevelt facing left, with Liberty along the left side, In God We Trust beneath the portrait, and the date and mint mark positioned near the lower right portion of the design. On the reverse is the powerful combination of a flaming torch, an olive branch, and an oak branch, representing liberty, peace, and strength. By 1982, the design had already been circulating for more than 3 decades and had become one of the most familiar objects in American pocket change. But there is one major misconception that must be cleared away before discussing value. The 1982 D. Roosevelt dime is not a silver dime. The United States Mint removed silver from circulating Roosevelt dimes beginning in 1965, replacing the traditional silver composition with copper-nickel-clad construction. The 1982 D therefore consists of outer layers containing 75% copper and 25% nickel bonded to a pure copper core. Its diameter is approximately 17.9 millimeters and its standard weight is about 2.27 grams with a reeded edge. This composition matters because people sometimes see a dark or toned 1982 dime and assume that discoloration indicates silver content. It does not. A naturally toned surface can be interesting, but toning does not transform a clad dime into a silver coin. In fact, if your 1982 D has scratches, heavy circulation wear, or signs of cleaning, those factors can dramatically reduce its desirability compared with a problem-free mint state example. Now we arrive at the most important question. If more than 542 million 1982 D dimes were made, how can one possibly become valuable? The answer is that mintage is only the beginning of the story. A coin can have a huge original production number but become difficult to obtain in exceptional condition because everyday circulation destroys the qualities collectors want most. Imagine millions of these dimes leaving the Denver Mint in 1982 and entering cash registers, vending machines, bank rolls, pockets, purses, drawers, and coin jars. Every contact with another coin could create a tiny abrasion. Every fall onto a hard surface could produce a rim mark. Every transaction could add another scratch. Over decades, those small imperfections accumulate. This is why the population of coins surviving in gem condition can be dramatically smaller than the original mintage. The highest value examples are not valuable because 542 million were produced. They are valuable because collectors may compete intensely for the very small number that combine exceptional preservation with an outstanding strike and desirable full bands detail. PCGS records demonstrate exactly how far the market can separate an ordinary example from a superb one. Strike quality is particularly important with Roosevelt dimes because collectors pay close attention to the horizontal bands across the torch on the reverse. When those bands are sharply and completely defined, the coin may qualify for the full bands or FB designation depending on the grading service and its standards. This is one of the reasons the 1982 D can become dramatically more interesting at the upper end of the grading scale. A coin can be technically uncirculated, yet lack the strong detail necessary to compete with the finest examples. Another coin from the same year can have nearly pristine surfaces and beautifully separated torch bands, and suddenly become much more desirable. PCGS lists the 1982 D as a major variety both with and without the full bands designation, and its records document an MS-67 full bands example reaching $1,410 in 2014. Graysheet's auction database also records numerous lower-grade full band sales, including a PCGS MS-66 full bands example that sold for $45 in May 2024. This enormous difference illustrates the central lesson of modern coin collecting. Grade and strike quality can matter far more than the date alone. At this point, collectors often ask whether the 1982 D has some secret large date, small date, double die, overdate, or famous repunchment mark variety that automatically makes every example valuable. The answer requires caution. The best-known 1982 Roosevelt dime variety is actually the Philadelphia issue missing its P mint mark, not the Denver D issue. In 1982, Philadelphia struck Roosevelt dimes that accidentally left the mint without the expected P mint mark, creating the famous 1982 no P dime. PCGS explains that two obverse dies were involved, producing strong and weak strike versions, and that this era became a major modern variety. That is an entirely different coin from a normal 1982D. Likewise, repunched mint marks are historically important within the Roosevelt dime series, but collectors should not automatically label every unusual-looking D on a 1982D as a repunched mint mark. A genuine double die results from a specific error in the die-making process, while strike doubling can produce a completely different appearance. A mint mark anomaly must be examined against recognized variety diagnostics before it is considered valuable. Next up in the 1986D Roosevelt dime happened to possess the right combination of exceptional preservation, sharply defined details, full bands, or a genuine minting error. Suddenly, the story changes. The important truth about the 1986D dime is that it is not a rare silver coin, and an ordinary circulated example is generally worth only around face value. Yet this is exactly what makes the search fascinating. Enormous numbers were struck, but the very best survivors can enter a completely different collecting world. The 1986D Roosevelt dime was produced at the Denver Mint during an era when American pocket change was overwhelmingly made from modern copper-nickel-clad compositions. According to NGC, the Denver Mint struck 473,326,970 examples that year. That sounds like an impossible number for a rare coin, and for normal circulated pieces it is. But collectors do not simply collect dates, they collect condition, strike quality, varieties, errors, and exceptional examples. PCGS records an auction result of $1,320 for a PCGS MS67 full bands 1986D dime sold by Heritage Auctions on October 21, 2020. That enormous difference between 10 cents and four figures is where the real mystery begins. To understand why this little coin attracts attention, we have to travel back to 1986. America was in the middle of a rapidly changing decade. The economy was expanding after the severe early 1980s recession. Technology was transforming workplaces and homes. Personal computers were becoming increasingly visible, and American popular culture was moving rapidly toward the modern world we recognize today. The United States was also living through the tensions of the Cold War, while the Reagan administration dominated national politics. In the same year, the Space Shuttle program was shaken by the Challenger disaster, an event that deeply affected the American public and became one of the defining moments of the decade. Against that enormous historical backdrop, millions of ordinary coins quietly moved through the economy. A 1986D dime could have purchased a small item, been handed to a cashier, dropped into a vending machine, placed in a jar, or carried for years in a pocket. That everyday journey is part of the coin's story. Unlike a commemorative medal created specifically to be preserved, this dime was born to circulate. Every scratch, contact mark, and abrasion represents the economic life of 1980s America. And that is why finding one today in extraordinary condition can be surprisingly difficult. The coin was never intended to survive as a pristine collectible. The 1986D belongs to the Roosevelt dime series, introduced in 1946 to honor President Franklin Delano Roosevelt after his death in 1945. The design was created by John R. Sinek, whose work became one of the most recognizable pieces of American 20th century coinage. On the obverse, Roosevelt faces left, with the inscriptions Liberty and In God We Trust surrounding his portrait, while the date sits below. On the reverse are the torch, olive branch, and oak branch, symbols traditionally associated with liberty and peace, along with United States of America, EPLUBUSUNUM, and one dime. The 1986D has the classic modern clad construction, a copper-nickel outer layer bonded to a pure copper core, weighing approximately 2.27 grams and measuring about 17.9 millimeters across. The edge is reeded, and the Denver D appears on the obverse near the lower right area beside the date. This is an important distinction for anyone examining a coin advertised as a potentially valuable 1986D dime. It is not a 90% silver Roosevelt dime like the pre-1965 issues. The value of a normal 1986D, therefore, comes from collectability rather than precious metal content. Now comes the number that can be misleading: 473,326,970. That is the official mintage reported for the 1986 D. Roosevelt dime, and at first glance it seems to destroy any possibility of rarity. But mintage is only the beginning of the story. A coin can have hundreds of millions struck and still become scarce in a particular grade. Think of the difference between surviving and surviving beautifully. The vast majority of 1986 D dimes entered circulation, where they encountered pockets, purses, cash registers, coin machines, drawers, floors, and countless other sources of contact. Millions may still exist, but comparatively few can meet the demanding standards required for the highest mint state grades. PCGS estimates roughly 1.42 million survivors for its regular strike population model, with about 14,199 estimated at MS65 or better, illustrating how dramatically the population narrows as condition rises. These figures are estimates rather than a literal census of every surviving coin, but they demonstrate the principle perfectly. A coin does not have to be rare in existence to be rare in elite condition. That is the central lesson of the 1986 D dime. There is another feature that can completely change the conversation: full bands, often abbreviated FB. On the reverse of a Roosevelt dime, the horizontal bands crossing the central torch are examined closely by graders. When those bands are sharply separated and uninterrupted in the required areas, the coin may qualify for a full bands designation. For modern Roosevelt dimes, that distinction can be extremely important because collectors competing for top-quality registry sets often want examples with exceptional strike characteristics. A normal MS65 coin may be desirable, but an MS67 full bands example can become a fundamentally different collectible. NGC's current information for the 1986 D shows certified examples reaching MS67 full torch, while PCGS records the famous MS67 FB auction result at $1,320. Great Collections has also recorded sales of 1986 D full bands examples ranging from modest amounts in lower grades to $939.38 for a PCGS MS67 FB example from the L.S. Brown collection. These results reveal something crucial. The highest prices are not representative of every 1986 D dime. They are prizes for exceptional certified examples. So what about the coin sitting in front of you if it is scratched and toned? This is where honesty matters. A scratched, circulated 1986 D dime should not automatically be described as an ultra-rare treasure. Scratches generally reduce desirability, particularly when they are deep or distracting, and a coin that has clearly circulated will not compete with pristine mint state pieces. Tunning is different. Natural tunning can sometimes be attractive and may provide evidence that the coin has remained undisturbed for a long period, but artificial tunning, harsh cleaning, polishing, or chemical treatment can have the opposite effect. A collector examining your dime would want to determine whether the surface is original, whether the marks are ordinary circulation damage or evidence of something unusual, whether the strike is strong, and whether any discoloration is natural. Cleaning is particularly important because a coin can look bright and impressive to an inexperienced eye while actually losing collector appeal. Professional grading companies evaluate surfaces, luster, strike, color, marks, and overall preservation. If a coin appears to have been harshly cleaned or damaged, a premium grade may be impossible even if the date and mint mark are correct. Next question is where varieties and errors enter the story. There is no reason to assume that every 1986 D dime with a strange-looking date, doubled feature, die crack, or unusual edge is a major rarity. Genuine varieties must be identified carefully. Collectors may investigate doubled dies, die cracks, repunched features where applicable, off-center strikes, clipped planchets, broad strikes, struck-through errors, missing or distorted design elements, and other mint-made abnormalities. However, the 1986 D dime does not become valuable simply because someone notices a doubling effect with the naked eye. Machine doubling, die deterioration, post-mint damage, scratches, and mechanical distortions can imitate genuine varieties. The distinction begins inside the minting process. A die is manufactured to transfer the design onto planchets, and errors can originate during die preparation, hubbing, die maintenance, planchet production, or striking. If a coin is struck dramatically off-center, if a major portion of the design is missing because of a genuine planchet or striking problem, or if an authenticated double die is discovered, the collectible status can change dramatically. But each claimed error requires verification rather than imagination. It is also important to correct a common misconception about the 1986 D specifically. This is not a wartime coin, and stories about wartime die stress or hand-punched mint marks do not automatically apply to it. By 1986, United States mint production methods and mint mark practices were very different from the wartime and earlier eras in which certain mint marks were manually punched into working dies. Likewise, a supposed large date or small date should not be treated as automatically valuable simply because the numerals appear different under magnification. Next up in the 1990 D Roosevelt dime has an important secret. The ordinary coin is common, while an extraordinary example can become surprisingly desirable when exceptional condition, full bands detail, or a genuine minting error enters the story. The coin we are examining today carries the Denver D mint mark, and based on the scratched and toned condition described here, it would not normally qualify as a high-value mint state specimen. In fact, the standard 1990 D dime is not a silver coin. It is a copper-nickel-clad dime containing a pure copper center with a total composition of 75% copper and 25% nickel. The United States Mint produced 839,995,824 of these dimes at Denver, so rarity cannot simply be claimed because the coin is old or because it has a D mint mark. The real mystery is what happens when an ordinary modern dime survives in an extraordinary state, or carries an authentic variety that separates it from millions of normal pieces. To understand why the 1990 D exists, we have to travel back to the world of 1990. The United States was entering a new decade marked by technological change, economic uncertainty, and major international developments. The Cold War was approaching its final chapter. The Berlin Wall had fallen only months earlier, and the Soviet Union was moving toward historic political transformation. At home, Americans were living in a period of rapidly changing technology, expanding personal computing, popular culture, and a consumer economy that was beginning to feel the effects of recessionary pressure. Into this environment came the familiar Roosevelt dime, a denomination Americans used constantly for vending machines, parking meters, stores, laundromats, telephone calls, and everyday transactions. The Roosevelt dime itself had begun in 1946, 1 year after President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's death. It honored a president associated with the Great Depression and the United States leadership through much of the Second World War. The design was created by John R. Sinek, and although the coin's composition changed after 1964, the basic Roosevelt design continued into the modern era. The 1990 D, therefore, represents not an ancient relic, but a modern chapter in one of America's longest-running circulating coin designs. Now look closely at the coin itself, because every detail tells part of the story. On the obverse is John R. Sinek's portrait of Franklin Roosevelt, facing left, with liberty around the upper left area, in God W.E. Trust, positioned near the lower left portion of the portrait, and the date 1990 to the right of Roosevelt's neck. Immediately beside the date is the D mint mark, identifying the Denver Mint. The reverse presents the symbolic torch of liberty in the center, surrounded by an olive branch and oak branch, while United States of America and one dime frame the design, with EPLUBUSUNUM completing the inscription. The dime measures approximately 17.9 millimeters and weighs about 2.27 grams, with a reeded edge. That small size is part of the challenge for collectors. Tiny marks can dramatically affect grade, and the raised details of the torch can lose sharpness through either weak striking or ordinary circulation. When a dime spends years moving through pockets, vending machines, cash registers, and coin counting machines, its surfaces can accumulate contact marks almost immediately. That is why an apparently ordinary 1990 D can be common, while an almost untouched example becomes much harder to locate. And this brings us to the number that often creates confusion: 839,995,824. That is an enormous production figure, and it immediately tells us that the normal 1990D is not a scarce date and mint mark combination. NGC specifically notes that Roosevelt dimes generally do not have rare date and mint mark combinations, although some issues become scarce in very high grades or when they possess exceptionally complete details. But mintage is only the beginning of the rarity equation. Imagine nearly 840 million coins leaving the mint. Most were intended to circulate, meaning millions were exposed to friction, scratches, impacts, discoloration, and environmental damage. Over time, many were spent repeatedly and disappeared into commerce, while others were removed from circulation and saved in jars, albums, rolls, or mint sets. Yet the crucial question for serious collectors is not simply how many were made. It is how many survived with the exact combination of surfaces, strike, luster, preservation, and design detail that collectors want. This is why a common coin can become scarce at the very top of the grading scale. PCGS describes the 1990D as fairly common through approximately MS66, scarce in MS67, and very difficult to find at MS68 or higher. Now consider the condition of the specific coin in our story: scratched and toned. Those two words are extremely important because they immediately change the value discussion. Scratches are generally viewed negatively because professional grading evaluates surface preservation very carefully. A coin can be technically old and attractive, but visible scratches can prevent it from reaching the pristine mint state grades that create the biggest premiums. Tunning is different. Natural tunning can sometimes be attractive and completely original, especially when it develops gradually through storage and environmental exposure. But collectors and graders distinguish natural tunning from artificial or suspicious surface treatment. Cleaning is particularly dangerous for value because harsh rubbing, polishing, or chemical treatment can permanently alter the original surface and leave hairlines or unnatural brightness. For a scratched and toned 1990D, the realistic expectation is usually close to face value unless the coin contains a separately authenticated error or variety. A circulated example might trade for only around 10 to a few tens of cents, depending on the exact market and condition, while ordinary mint state examples can bring several dollars or more as grade rises. One current market source, for example, places circulated 1990D examples around face value and shows substantially higher figures for certified mint state grades, while actual auction records demonstrate that the finest pieces can command much stronger prices. But here is where the story becomes much more interesting: full bands. On Roosevelt dimes, collectors examine the horizontal bands crossing the torch on the reverse. When those bands are sharply and completely defined, grading services may designate the coin FB, meaning full bands. This detail matters because a dime can be technically uncirculated, yet lack the sharpness necessary for the premium designation. The 1990D is particularly interesting because exceptional strike quality is difficult at the highest levels. PCGS identifies the regular 1990D and a separate 1990D full bands variety designation, and notes that examples with full bands characteristics are very difficult to find and can command strong premiums. This is one of the clearest examples of why a coin's value cannot be determined simply by looking at its date. Two 1990D dimes may have been produced minutes apart, but one might have weakly defined torch bands and ordinary marks, while another could possess blazing luster, virtually flawless surfaces, and complete band separation. The second coin can become dramatically more desirable to registry collectors, even though both began life as 10-cent pieces from the same Denver production run. What about the famous Varieties collectors' search for large dates, small dates, double dies, repunched mint marks, overdates, die cracks, off-center strikes, and transitional errors? This is where caution is essential. There is no established major 1990D variety comparable to famous Roosevelt dime errors, such as the 1982 no-P dime or the classic double die varieties of earlier decades. More importantly, the 1990 D cannot legitimately be treated as valuable simply because the D looks doubled, the date appears unusual, or a scratch resembles a second number. The minting process itself explains why. Earlier Roosevelt dimes could receive individually punched mint marks on working dies, making genuine repunched mint marks possible. But beginning in 1990, the United States Mint incorporated mint marks into the die-making process rather than hand-punching them into individual working dies, eliminating the traditional repunched mint mark category for 1990 and later circulation issues. Genuine doubled dies are created much earlier in the die production process, when design elements become doubled during hubbing, while mechanical or machine doubling can occur during striking and often produces a very different appearance. Die cracks, chips, broad strikes, and off-center strikes arise from different mechanical failures or alignment problems. These errors can be collectible, but they must be genuine, clearly visible, and preferably authenticated before anyone attaches a large value to them. Next up in the 1995 D Roosevelt dime appears to be exactly what its enormous production numbers suggest, a common 10-cent coin. The Denver Mint struck approximately 1,274,890,000 examples that year, an astonishing number that immediately tells us this is not a classic rarity simply because of its date and mint mark. Yet this is precisely where the story becomes interesting. In modern coin collecting, rarity can hide inside enormous populations. The real question is not how many 1995 D dimes were made, but how many survived in exceptional condition, how many possess unusually strong strikes, how many qualify for full bands designation, and whether an individual coin carries a genuine mint-made error or recognized die variety. PCGS records the 1995 D dime at a mintage of 1,274,890,000 and identifies the finest regular examples in the upper mint state grades as dramatically scarcer than the billions struck would suggest. So if you have a scratched and toned 1995 D dime in your hand right now, don't assume it is a fortune, but don't dismiss it either. The fascinating part of this coin is understanding exactly what would have to happen for an ordinary 10-cent piece to cross the enormous gap between face value and serious collector value. To understand why the 1995 D dime exists at all, we have to travel back almost half a century before it was struck. The Roosevelt dime was introduced in 1946, shortly after the death of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and the United States Mint chose the 10-cent denomination partly because Roosevelt had become strongly associated with the March of Dimes and the fight against polio. The design was created by chief engraver John R. Sinek, whose work became one of the most recognizable designs in American circulating coinage. Roosevelt faces left on the obverse, surrounded by Liberty and In God We Trust, with Sinek's initials JS appearing near the bottom of the portrait. On the reverse stands the famous torch, surrounded by an olive branch and an oak branch, symbols associated with liberty, peace, and strength. The design was introduced on January 30, 1946, Roosevelt's birthday, and continued for decades. By 1995, the design was already nearly 50 years old, meaning the Denver Mint was producing a coin whose visual identity connected everyday Americans in the 1990s with the immediate post-war era of the 1940s. That historical continuity is one reason Roosevelt dimes remain so popular. The same basic design passed through enormous changes in American life, from the post-war boom to the Cold War, the space age, the digital revolution, and eventually the internet age. And 1995 itself was a remarkable year in the United States. Bill Clinton was president. The country was experiencing a period of technological transformation. Personal computers were becoming increasingly common. The internet was beginning to reshape communication, and American popular culture was moving rapidly toward the digital world that would dominate the following decades. But beneath the optimism was intense political conflict. In April 1995, the Oklahoma City bombing shocked the nation and became one of the darkest domestic events of the decade. Later that year, Disputes between President Clinton and Congress over federal spending produced government funding gaps and shutdowns, including a major shutdown beginning in December that continued into January 1996. Somewhere during this turbulent period, huge quantities of ordinary money were moving through American commerce, and among those coins were the 1995 Roosevelt dimes. They passed through cash registers, vending machines, banks, restaurants, gas stations, pockets, jars, and drawers. Most were treated as money, not collectibles. People spent them without thinking twice. That is important because circulation is one of the main reasons a modern coin can become difficult to find in truly exceptional condition. 1 billion coins can be produced, but the overwhelming majority are not carefully protected. They collide with other coins, scrape against metal surfaces, become stained, accumulate scratches, and slowly lose the pristine appearance that elite collectors demand. The composition of the 1995 D-dime also changes the story completely when compared with the famous silver Roosevelt dimes of the 1940s, 1950s, and early 1960s. The 1995 D is not a silver dime. It is a copper-nickel-clad coin with a copper core, weighing about 2.27 grams and measuring approximately 17.9 millimeters across, with a reeded edge. That means the intrinsic metal value is not what creates its collectible potential. Instead, the premium comes from condition, scarcity, error status, variety attribution, strike quality, certification, and collector demand. This distinction is crucial because online videos sometimes create the impression that every old-looking dime is secretly worth hundreds or thousands of dollars. The 1995 D does not fit that narrative. Its massive mintage means a normal circulated example is generally worth around face value, and even ordinary mint state pieces are not automatically rare. But there is a fascinating ceiling above the ordinary coin. PCGS specifically notes that while MS-65 examples can be found by searching rolls or mint sets, MS-66 becomes scarce, MS-67 is much harder to locate, and MS-68 is genuinely scarce, with PCGS describing fewer than a dozen known at that level in the cited population discussion. This is the great paradox of the 1995 D. More than 1.27 billion were made, yet the number that survived in extraordinary condition is tiny by comparison. Now look closely at the coin described in this video, scratched and toned. Those two words immediately become important. Scratches are among the most damaging characteristics for a coin seeking a premium grade because professional grading considers surface preservation extremely carefully. A coin can have a beautiful date, sharp lettering, and attractive color, but deep or numerous scratches can prevent it from reaching the high mint state levels where the serious premiums begin. Tunning is different. Natural tunning is not automatically damage. Depending on its appearance, originality, intensity, and collector appeal, natural tunning can sometimes be perfectly acceptable and even attractive. But there is an enormous difference between natural tunning and artificial alteration. A coin that has developed gentle coloration through long-term storage can retain its originality, while a coin that has been harshly cleaned may show unnatural brightness, hairlines, or disturbed surfaces that reduce its desirability. This is why collectors should resist the temptation to polish a toned 1995 D-dime simply because they believe making it shiny will make it more valuable. Cleaning can do exactly the opposite. For a scratched and toned example, the realistic expectation is usually modest value, unless an important variety or dramatic mint error is present. Professional grading becomes most meaningful when the coin appears genuinely exceptional, when an unusual error is suspected, or when the owner believes the piece might compete at a very high grade. The most exciting possibility is a genuine mint error, but this is also where careful identification becomes essential. A doubled appearance on a 1995 D-dime does not automatically mean a valuable doubled die. True hub doubling occurs during the die-making process when a hub impresses a design into a die in a misaligned or shifted manner, potentially creating distinct doubled design elements. Machine doubling, die deterioration, strike-related distortion, and other forms of apparent doubling can look impressive to the untrained eye, but may carry little or no major premium. The 1995 D date also needs to be treated carefully because the mint mark is not necessarily evidence of a traditional old-style repunched mint mark variety. By the 1990s, mint mark production practices had changed from the earlier era when individual mint marks were punched into working dies. Consequently, claims about a 1995 D repunched mint mark require especially strong attribution, rather than simply seeing what looks like a secondary outline around the D. NGC's broader Roosevelt dime variety references show that the series contains many legitimate double die and repunch mint mark varieties, but they also emphasize that the recognized varieties are specific and require proper diagnostics. For a 1995 D, collectors should be skeptical of vague claims involving large dates, small dates, overdates, or dramatic doubled mint marks unless a recognized specialist attribution supports the claim. A die crack, die chip, off-center strike, broad strike, clip planchet, or other major mint error can be a different story entirely, because the more obvious and genuinely scarce the production mistake, the stronger the potential collector premium can become. This is also why the idea of a rare 1995 D dime needs to be divided into several completely different categories. The first category is the ordinary circulated coin. A scratched, toned example with normal wear and no authenticated variety is generally a face value coin or a very modest premium, depending on circumstances. The second category is the better preserved uncirculated coin, where condition begins to matter substantially.